So before we move on, let me just also explain that my book happens to reside within a very active and vital debate in the American political parties literature at the moment. John Aldrich, whom my book and my work really sort of aligns with, is in a very active debate with Marty Cohen and John Zoller, who wrote a book called The Party Decides. These two books have very different views about what the nature of political parties are. Aldrich's parties world, as I said, it sort of aligns with mine. It is this idea that parties are essentially politician-centered. They are essentially moving and changing based upon the desires of the office holders and office seekers within them. The Party Decides says, no, they are not these endogenous institutions that you believe they are. They are actually groups of interests and special sort of factions, and the nominees are really agents of the party, not leaders of the party. So I say, no, I don't think that they're agents. I don't believe that nominees would be selected absent aspirant opportunism. I think there are far too many people within a political party who would love to be the presidential nominee for the groups to make the decision. So I see this as very much an individual thing. And the way that I describe this, how I view parties within my work, is I often think about them like competing organizations, like the Coca-Cola company and the Pepsi company, right? There are vice presidents sort of riven all throughout those corporations who are dying to be CEO. They're competing with each other, they're trying to get to the top, and once they get to the top, they want to dominate the market. And that's the way that I see aspirants, that whether they are one cycle away from running or whether they are 10 cycles away from running, they have been tilting toward the White House since the moment they entered politics. And that is what is moving our political system. So with that, let me just say a little bit about ambition. One of the other things that is fascinating is within the political science literature, there is a long tradition of discussing ambition. And this really started with a book by Schlesinger, and this work has this idea in it that politicians differ in terms of how progressive their ambition is, how high they want to go in terms of office seeking. Well, here's my problem. I believe that all presidential aspirants are inordinately ambitious. I think they all reside at one end of the spectrum, so I don't think that there's much variation among them on that idea. I think that they probably differ greatly from individuals who, say, only served in the state legislature and stayed there for many terms. But they don't really differ from each other. So I needed to think about other ways or other variables to find some leverage on how to differentiate between winners and losers. I'm not going to talk all that much about experience, but the experience measure is an important idea because it actually plays into how I discuss opportunism, and I'll get to that in a minute. But experience in my worldview, and I think in much of the literature's worldview, not necessarily the political science literature, but certainly the business literature, the psychological literature, and the like, is that experience is really about learning, right? What good is an experience if you've learned nothing from it? So experience is, on the one hand, a very observable, concrete, empirical piece of evidence with which we can differentiate aspirants. But the problem is, it's not a perfect measure, certainly, because a lot of people have a lot of experiences that they don't learn much from. In addition, there are different kinds of experiences. And there's a quote by Rexford Tugwell, who wrote sort of a wonderful book on all of the people who ran for the presidency. And he said, nothing that a man has done or gone through, only what he has specifically learned is much good to him in the White House. And I think that that's right. There is this issue where you can have all the experience in the world and fail, and you can have limited experience and succeed. And this was the other piece of the literature that I was trying to address. Much of the current political science literature says experience doesn't matter. And I thought, that just doesn't make intuitive sense. We don't give someone who's just received an MBA the position as CEO of a Fortune 500 company. We assume that experience means something. But the real question was how to get it to mean something, how to try to get it to represent learning, and how to have it understand sort of a more complicated idea. I sort of think of the way I tried to explain experience much in the way that people try to understand intelligence by measuring education. We know that levels of education does not actually equate to intelligence, but it's one of the best proxies we have. So I used experience in much that same way in trying to get some leverage on this idea of learning. What does it mean to have learned something? Do people who have different experiences learn different things? So I started with this idea that breadth of experience is different than depth of experience. I think that this makes more intuitive sense, and much of this work, if you'll notice, I keep referring back to the business world, but I think much of it makes sense when you think about it in terms of business. When we think of somebody who had a 20-year career, say, I don't know, in technology, if they spent all 20 years at IBM, we would imagine that they would have a very different perspective on the technology industry than somebody who, say, spent 4 years at 5 different technology companies. They would both have 20 years of experience, but they would likely have very different perspectives, very different lessons that they've learned, very different views on the marketplace. Now, within political science, there's also a long-time phrase that says, where you stand depends a great deal upon where you sit. And that understanding that your institution impacts how you perceive the political space was part of the other reason why I believed that breadth would likely matter more than depth. Because to run for the presidency, you have to be able to essentially capitalize and exploit opportunities in such ways that you promote your ambitions. But what does that mean? Well, it means that you better be pretty perceptive about the tidal waves that are coming. And my belief is people who have sat in more positions tend to be more perceptive of the environment in which they're in. They have seen more variety, if you will. So experience then actually becomes the way that I measure opportunism. I use breadth and depth as a ratio statistic. And I basically say breadth over depth equals your level of opportunism. As I said earlier, it's a fairly crude measure. It's trying to get at learning. There's not much in the way of sort of nuance, because I also happen to believe that opportunism is about temperament and skill sets. The people who have been at many places, say, 5 different companies, all within the same sector, they also tend to have a different temperament than the person who has been at one place for 20 years. So I believe that opportunism is sort of a much broader concept, but in this study I measure it very narrowly, and it's not until you sort of get into the case study chapters where you see it kind of playing out in its much broader ways. Today I'm not really going to go into those. I'm going to just stay focused on kind of some of the quantitative findings that I did report. So I'm going to talk about the 2 other issues in a little bit more in-depth way, opportunism and luck. I think when you look at these pictures, right, how can you tell who's a winner here and who's a loser here? Can everybody in this room identify all 4 of these men? Probably not. So you have James Garfield, who was president, James K. Polk, who was a president, William Jennings Bryan, who was a loser, and Henry Clay, who was probably the ultimate loser, 5 times losing the presidency. He actually has my, I think, favorite quote when he's referring to his parties. He actually says at one point, "My friends," and he's referring to his fellow partisans, he says, "are not worth the shot and powder it would take to kill them." So you can tell he was pretty frustrated after losing 5 times. So this is actually a quote by Woodrow Wilson. And again, I begin the book with this because there's such a predisposition toward a negative understanding of opportunism. That word just makes people think, oh, it's somebody who is exploiting things for their own benefit. But then again, right, to not take advantage of opportunities oftentimes means you're foolish. So why is it that somebody who's labeled an opportunist is thought ill of? And Woodrow Wilson gets at this. He writes this in 1907, and he says, "A politician, a man engaged in party contests, must be an opportunist. Let us give up saying that word as if it contained a slur. If you want to win in party action, I take it for granted you want to lure the majority to your side. I never heard of any man in his senses who was fishing for a minority. Now, if you want to win, you've got to fish for the majority. And the only majority you can get is the majority that is ready. You can't wait for the majority of tomorrow if you want to win a majority today. You've got to take the opportunity as you find it and work on that, and that is opportunism, and that is politics, and it is perfectly legitimate." So I'd like to also kind of bust up some of these notions about this idea that all opportunism is negative. I see opportunism as I see ambition. And what I mean by that is that ambition is not necessarily normatively negative. It all depends on what you direct your efforts to. I mean, to be a great fundraiser for your church because you're ambitiously pursuing that goal, I wouldn't consider that person to be doing normatively negative things. So I think both ambition and opportunism have this interesting ambiguity within them. They can be used for good, they can be used for bad. So let me just say the way I describe opportunism is this. It's the ability to turn events and conditions to one's favor. It is the how and when to act. In other words, ambition provides the energy to initiate and sustain an arduous journey. Opportunism provides the perspective on which path to pursue to reach one's destination. Hence, the relationship between ambition and opportunism may be thought similar to that between intelligence and wisdom. You have the raw stuff. You have to apply it in good ways. This is the other thing that comes up consistently in the literature. Like I said, if you believe that nominees are accidentally selected, that they just somehow got there in something of a random way, then oftentimes you subscribe to luck. I think one of the more fascinating things is the deeper you get into presidential campaigns, the more you see luck actually is defined best this way. It is about adding craft to accident. And that is not my definition, but I do love it because I think it appropriately describes what luck is. An accident occurs, you then have the ability to turn that to be lucky. And as a result, these individuals are who run for office. I mean, William McKinley is one of my favorite examples because most of the literature, up until some very recent studies in the last couple years, have essentially said that he was just lucky. There was a panic in 1893. He got very lucky in being the out-party person, and he ran a campaign all the way from his front porch, and he won. McKinley certainly didn't subscribe to that. And as you can see, he very clearly says, I've never been in doubt since I was old enough to think intelligently that I would someday be made president. These people have been pursuing that. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this notion of opportunity and luck, let me just say one other thing about where the word opportunity comes from, because it's somewhat fascinating. It actually comes from the Latin porta, which means a passage through or entryway. And it is from this root that we derive words associated with doors. It is also related to the Greek word poros, which was not only a passageway for ships, but from where we get the word pore, openings in the skin. Hence, opportunists can be thought of as pore seekers. They look for small openings which have the possibility of turning the tables dramatically. So this is what opportunists do. They perceive openings, they move to actually change the dynamics within them, and then it actually turns to their favor. And most of the time, things appear to have been done as though they were just lucky. There's another political scientist by the name of William Riker who referred to people who could do these things as heuristicians. And I talk about these opportunists as being skilled heuristicians. He explains that they win because they have set up the situation in such a way that other people will want to join them, will feel forced by circumstances to join them, even without any persuasion at all. So in short, opportunism is a character trait that's a combination of innate temperament, sort of a flexibility, a creativity, a perceptivity, and learned abilities, say skills in politics, things like speech making or fundraising, and also learned strategies, things like divide and conquer, that are acquired through experience. So now that you sort of have all this background into the ideas that I was exploring, let me just kind of quickly describe what kind of the two central claims of my research. There are many more claims that run throughout this 500-page book, but these are the two really central claims. As I said, I'm trying to explain how the parties are created, developed, and changed. And I argue that it's the aspirants within them that are changing them. I see them as constantly in competition with one another, never really sort of letting down on the competition, always working to try to maneuver and move the party to be essentially a reflection of their strategic priorities about what they think the party should be. Because if the party becomes what they want it to be, not only will they be selected as the nominee, but then their party will be strong enough to actually get them elected to the White House. And that's why all of this work within parties becomes so important. So my first sort of big claim is that presidential aspirants, their intra and inter-party competition drives parties and party change in America. Thus, they are responsible for the development of the presidential selection process, as well as the ideological trajectories and coalitional bases of the parties. There is a quote by Lincoln that I want to read you because he seems to have explained this back in April of 1859. It was a letter where he was declining an invitation to an Independence Day celebration. And while eulogizing Jefferson and condemning slavery, he remarked on how the Republicans of his day were more the descendants of Jefferson than the Democrats. And here's what he said. I remember once being much amused at seeing two partially intoxicated men engage in a fight with their great coats on, which fight, after a long and rather harmless contest, ended in each having fought himself out of his own coat and into that of the other. If the two leading parties of this day are really identical with the two in the days of Jefferson and Adams, they have performed about the same feat as the two drunken men. But more soberly, It is now no child's play to save the principles of Jefferson from total overthrow in this nation. So similar to these drunks, aspirants, through their efforts to strengthen their parties and win the presidency, through their competition, they at times swap coats. Okay, the second big claim. So if the first one is about parties, this is about me trying to bridge this party literature, the party development literature, and the campaigns and elections and presidency literatures. So the first big claim is that parties are driven and changed by these aspirants. Then my second claim is about the aspirants themselves. And it says, successful aspirants are opportunists who know how to foster and exploit events and conditions to promote their political ambitions. Thus, they are heuristicians who understand the art of setting up situations and know how to add craft to accident. So this is what I believe differentiates the winners from the losers. Then they are operating within this world of incredibly competitive parties. For those of you who like a little visual, here's essentially the claims that I make about my model. I believe that, as I said, experience and opportunism are related to each other. They affect one another. And then I believe that opportunism affects electoral success, but it also affects partisan change and institutional development, which then also affects electoral success. One of the things that's amazing when you start reading the party's literature and the presidential campaign literature is you start to see things like Andrew Jackson helped to get the 2/3 rule instituted into the Democratic Party convention because most of his support was in the South and the West. And in other words, he then could control the nomination because everybody else would have needed 2/3 and they could not garner 2/3 in the South and the West to beat him. In fact, the 2/3 rule ends up becoming the downfall of Martin Van Buren's attempt in 1844, the one in which Polk ends up winning. And interestingly enough, Martin Van Buren, the northerner, New Yorker, actually falls sort of victim to the rule. But then anyone know the New Yorker who changes the rule? FDR. So a New Yorker falls prey to it, a New Yorker overturns it. These are the kinds of things that change the elections, and they change the outcomes because these opportunists have maneuvered for their benefit. The one thing I didn't mention on here is that time actually affects every variable in this model. I described that in different party eras, there are essentially both different opportunities within the party to exploit, and there are different successful aspirant strategies. So I do divide history into 3 periods. And those 3 periods, they are in some ways more functional than theoretical, but they are not devoid of meaning. So and the reason why I say they're more functional than sort of theoretical is that this study really does believe that change happens continuously, that it is little tiny movements in each cycle. And so to put these big sort of markers is somewhat just a way to help us as analysts trying to make sense of this system. It's also why I don't have very descriptive party titles. I had thought at different points in time in doing this research that I might have some exciting party titles, but because I didn't want to make too many claims about these eras, I thought I would leave them rather basic. So the early party era actually extends from the time that Washington essentially steps down in 1796 all the way up to 1860. This is an incredibly changeable period. Parties are being formed, they are falling away. nomination procedures are constantly a different one almost every cycle. The political parties are not essentially in their two-party place until Lincoln wins in 1860 and establishes the second major party, the Republicans. The winning strategy ends up being this notion of sort of statesman-like national leadership. There is actually a quote by one of my favorites, Alexander Hamilton, who he pretty much describes how it is that these individuals in this first party era essentially vault up to the top. Now, what he doesn't describe is the balancing act that they must have around trying to appear nonpartisan and statesmanlike. But this is what he says. He says, when a man is seen to mount the hobby horse of popularity, to join in the cry of danger to liberty, to take every opportunity of embarrassing the general government and bringing it under suspicion, to flatter and fall with all the nonsense of the zealots of the day, it may be justly suspected that his object is to throw things into confusion so that he may ride the storm and direct the whirlwind. In other words, these aspirants in the early era were all about showing that they could control the chaos that was this system. So whether you have Jefferson, whether you have Andrew Jackson, these sort of bigger than life people get on top of it. And this is one of the things that's interesting. Henry Clay basically misses his moment. He tries to do this in 1844, and, well, things have started to change. And what things have changed into is a much more stable party. You have national conventions that have become pretty regularized by 1864. All the parties have them. Everybody knows what to do. And one of the things that is also going on in the post-Civil War era is, while we don't typically think of that time frame as being competitive nationally, quite frankly, once the South is brought back in, it very much is. Many of the elections end up swinging on the votes of New York, and just the votes of New York, or the votes of Indiana, or the votes of Ohio. So one of the things that's developing during this time, though, are very strong parties, strong bosses, strong machines. So the way that you rise up to the top in that sort of a situation is you actually become what I refer to as an enlightened partisan. You have sort of an enlightened partisan, and then you engage in a great deal of shows of loyalty. And what that means is that you defer often. There's actually a great quote by McKinley, sort of later in one of my case studies, where he sort of describes how he has to, in 1892, essentially defer. And there's a wonderful story about how he and Mark Hanna completely staged the 1892 election to show how loyal he is being to his party. But everybody also knows that McKinley is for the people. So he is sort of the enlightened great person who's doing this balancing act between being for the people and serving the party bosses. In our modern era, I explain that what you have is a very frantic type of system, and part of this has to do with the fact that the McGovern-Fraser reforms kind of unhinged the process. It made it so that every year's election calendar is different. It made it so that the rules get tinkered with in between conventions. There is a great deal more at just the nomination level that didn't have to be taken into consideration beforehand. The parties are still competitive between each other. The most interesting thing about this time is that during this period, the political parties essentially swap bases, right? Southern Democrats become Southern Republicans, Northern Republicans become Northern Democrats. So it's amazing how the bases switch on the basis, I think, of this competitiveness. I'm going to leave the postmodern party discussion. This is really actually a discussion that I have in the last two chapters of the book. It is sort of my belief about where we are headed based upon what we have come from and what sorts of leadership is required. Before I move on, let me just say something about enterprising factional representation. The individuals who are competing in the modern party era are all about showing that they are outsiders, even when they are not. They are also about being charismatic so that they can appeal to television audiences. And they also are about leading the charge on a ideological battle. So whether it's Ronald Reagan sort of leading a limited government, more states' rights type of appeal in 1980, or whether it's Bill Clinton taking the New Democrats into office, or whether it is George W. Bush trying to describe what it means to be a compassionate conservative. All of these people are essentially saying, we want the party to be different than what it is. So they are actually challenging the party in the way that the old folks used to challenge the party bosses. But they are now essentially, let's say, doing it for TV, not just for a smaller audience. So, let's see. So let me just say this. This is sort of the summary of this era. More generally, these successful aspirants balanced each era's contradictory pressures on their way up the nomination ladder, maneuvered adeptly through the briar patch that is party politics, exploiting the opportunities in their parties. Those in the first period sought to control the chaos that was the party system. Those in the second sought to undo the structures that the first aspirants had created. And those in the third sought to create alternative organizations because those in the second period had made the parties close to unmanageable. Hence, the historical periods in this study represent an attempt to group aspirants across time in ways that focus less on the aspirant's place in a partisan or presidential regime and more on the aspirant's challenge given the prevailing institutional structures in their party at the time of their candidacy. Okay, so now we're going to zoom through the results. And these are all probably too small for you to really see, but as I said, I measured breadth was a measure of political experience that looked at the number of positions individuals served at the federal and state level. I also include the number of campaigns they ran, whether they won or lost, because this is fundamentally a measure about learning, and I believe that people oftentimes learn more by what they lose than by when they win. So what you can see is that, although you may not be able to in the back, but what I will tell you is that when you look overall, you can see that on average, all of the aspirants, all 353 who have been charging from 1796 to 2004, had a mean breadth of about 7 positions. All presidents had a mean breadth of about 9. And one of the things that's fascinating is as you work sort of through the process, as the number of aspirants winnows, the higher levels of breadth you get, and typically either the same amount of depth or a lower level of depth you get. So that is why what you see is that for almost all of history, basically the mean opportunism score has been a little bit above 0.5. Half the number of positions to the number of years you've served in those positions. There are, though, some disturbing trends. One of the things that's highlighted in red, though like I said you may not be able to see it, is that in the first 2 eras, what you saw was that the presidents had both more breadth and depth than the major party nominees. Okay, so out of the 2 that are selected, the one that wins actually has more breadth and depth. That's true in both the early party era and the strong party era. Fascinatingly, it's not true today. Our presidents are now have essentially less breadth and less depth, and what is even more surprising is more opportunism. So what is fascinating to me about this is, what does it say? It says that we are creating amateur opportunists to get into our presidency. In other words, if Jefferson had 17 over 32, okay, that's his actual raw score. 17 positions ran or sought before he runs for the presidency, 32 years of being in political office. George W. Bush had 3 and 6. So you're talking about, both of them have similar opportunism scores, a little bit above 0.5, but their experience that is making up those score is profoundly different. So in other words, do I think that Jefferson would have beat George W. Bush? Probably. So here's some crosstabs which just go to show this. Oh, and I should mention this. One of the things that's fascinating is the percent of opportunists within each group, which is the last category on the slide. One of the things that you see is over the course of history, we essentially are electing more and more and more opportunists. We're now to the point where between 1972 and 2004, 100% of the presidents were opportunists. How I describe it, when 65% of the aspirants who started sort of that cycle were opportunists. So in other words, like I said, as this group winnows, typically their breadth and depth have increased, and essentially, typically, the number of opportunists within each one of those categories increases. Here's just some cross tabulations on the really simple level. I broke the major party nominee data at a 0.5, because basically 0.5 is the mean, and, well, I should say, like 498, I think is the mean. 0.513 is the median, and 0 and 0.5 are modes. So I essentially broke this data set at 0.5, the middle category, and then just looked at who won or who lost. As you can see, what you actually have is that the findings essentially reveal that even though there were nearly an equal number of opportunists and non-opportunists, about 69% of the 105 winners are opportunists, and about 60% of the 230 losers are non-opportunists. So just at the sort of bivariate level, these dummy variables have some leverage in what's going on in our system. I then use the actual ratio statistic of breadth to depth as my opportunism score. So I go back from having a dichotomous variable on opportunism to now having an interval level one. And what you essentially see, again, overall when it comes to the nomination, opportunism matters. These are determined on the basis of sort of whether or not one wins. These are logistic regression estimates. And I'm not, again, going to go into sort of some of their more details, but one of the things that is fascinating to me is that we now, in our modern party era, have a very different looking equation than in the other eras. The incumbent president variable is so weird because every one of our incumbents in the modern era have won. So there's no variation on that measure. But when I take it out of the model, it does strange things to some of the other things. I also ran an experiment where I made it as though Ted Kennedy beat Jimmy Carter, and then tried to run the model, and all of that worked out fine. But what you basically see is that the aspirant's office variable starts to matter, and opportunism doesn't. Now, the aspirant's office variable basically says, were you a governor, a vice president, or a cabinet member in your history? because many people have seen those offices as being stepping stones to the presidency. Interestingly enough, for most of our history, it doesn't matter. Interestingly, in the modern era, it does. And it does, especially with regard to being governor or vice president. What does this tell me? This tells me that we are more interested in what we perceive someone's experience to be, rather than necessarily what someone's actual experience is. Because if opportunism is this measure of learning and experience, it's a different perspective. This is the last slide, so we can get to taking some questions. But let me just say overall, as I sort of mentioned, I conclude with this idea that right now we have amateur opportunists in office. Those are the people that we are selecting into the presidency. They don't have a lot of experience making up their opportunism score. What is even more interesting is there seems to be a strange vicious cycle where we elect people because they say they're going to change Washington and they're outsiders, and then they get there and they fail, so then we decide we need another outsider. Now, you know, what's that phrase about doing the same thing over and over? There should be something that says maybe what we actually need is a politician. And in fact, Harry Truman once said, a statesman is a dead politician. And I basically say we might have a problem then if we are not electing politicians. We may not have statesmen, which could be problematic. There's also another quote, again by Bill Clinton, which I adore, which describes this. He says 100% of medical malpractice is committed by doctors. Therefore, when you need surgery, go to an electrician. So it's true, politicians mess up. They engage in malpractice all the time. Does that mean that we should get people who are not politicians to deal with them? I also conclude with an idea that perhaps we are in a new party era, and I'll, given the constraints of time, leave that aside, and I can go into that in questions if someone wants to. I didn't talk about sort of the Electoral College, but obviously this speaks to much of the Electoral College reform literature, the literature that says, you know, we need to reform the Electoral College because it's not democratic. My point here is maybe we ought to think a little bit about what the framers thought, which was that the method of selection seriously impacts the individual who is selected. And we should be careful with tampering that method, and we should probably think a lot more about who is getting selected as a group, these group of winners, presidents, than not. I also say that I think actually having presidents be opportunists is by and large a normatively positive thing. Certainly we've had some examples of opportunism run awry. I think Richard Nixon and Watergate was a good example of somebody who, quite frankly, he made it back to the presidency from rock bottom faster than anyone else in history. Clearly an opportunist. That may have also been what helped lead to Watergate. I think certainly, you know, Tony Blair said it, so I'm not going to say it about Clinton, but he did say that his curiosity probably led him to engage with Monica. And if we think about it in terms of opportunism, certainly he perhaps couldn't turn down that opportunity. The other reason why I would say that it's good to have opportunists is even though these people are wily and flexible and somewhat prone to some pretty negative character traits. Franklin Roosevelt once described himself as a juggler. Said, my left hand doesn't know what my right hand is doing, and if I have to lie to win this war, I will. He had no qualms about saying that. Why do I think that's positive? Well, because when you look around the rest of the world, the vast majority of heads of state are not democratically elected. I don't really want a naive person in our presidency. I would prefer that they could spot another con man if they saw them. Lastly, let me just say that given my findings, Palin, Romney, and Huckabee are probably the most likely nominees in 2012 for the Republican Party. Why? Because they've done it once. One of the things that comes up constantly in this literature is how much these people actually have to do it and fail. whether it's Jefferson in 1796, Jackson in 1824, and the like. You see this all through history. I think the other thing is that Palenti and Gingrich and Barber and John Thune, they may not know it yet, but if they do have a chance, they're probably playing for 2016, not 2012. And while it's doubtful that Obama's going to sort of draw a competitor, there is some speculation about both Howard Dean and Hillary Clinton. I would actually argue that Howard Dean would have a much better chance at winning, both because of his generally thought of opportunism and also his coalition within the Democratic Party, which is really, he would be able to lead that factional representation back to the party. So, okay, that was long. My apologies. Thank you for being so patient.
You have to say something about the Tea Party.
Well, actually, if you'd like me, I'll tell you what I would say. Here's what I believe. And this is, I did write this in my book. That on the surface, the postmodern party era appears reminiscent of the early part of the strong party era, where high levels of partisanship, turnout, activism, and competition coexisted alongside recurrent scandals and allegations of fraud and corruption. Morris Fiorina noted recently that since the mid-1980s, D words are no longer in fashion, and he means decline, de-alignment, things like that. He says R words have replaced them. The parties have returned, have revived, been reborn, been resurrected, been reinvigorated. The parties are resurging. We've entered an era of party renewal. And I said, if that is the case, and the parties now look like they used to during the strong party era, then it would be expected that today's aspirants would also begin looking like those aspirants from that earlier period. In other words, if those aspirants from the strong party era sought to be perceived as enlightened loyalists, interested in making their boss-led parties more open to rank-and-file partisans, then those from the postmodern party era may well be aiming to be perceived as pragmatic advocates interested in making their ideologue-led parties more open to independence. The aspirants from 2008, including Representative Ron Paul of Texas, who notably ran as a Republican and not an independent, suggests as much. So that's actually what I believe, that if we see that the Tea Parties are essentially taking over the Republican Party, then what we are going to see is we are going to see candidates much like Sarah Palin, who, by the way, has endorsed some moderate Republicans, trying to make the argument that parties shouldn't just be for Republicans. They should be for independents too. Huckabee actually won his Iowa race by bringing in the most ideological and the most independent within the Republican world. And I think that that ends up being the coalition that we'll see going forward. So a Huckabee, I mean, this is where I think Romney is disadvantaged. He does not have a strong factional, ideological part of the party that he can actually leverage to bring more in. Any other questions, thoughts? Wow. Well, that's good. Okay.
I mean, changing the party. Bill Clinton was a master of it.
Yes.
Creating the DLC and such. I mean, if you want to add anything to that, that's the first thing I thought of.
Well, I will say this. I did say in here that I think he is the politician of the modern party era who most resembles those from the strong party era. I mean, he was on the McGovern campaign in 1972. He, you know, even though he didn't run for that many offices and his opportunism score is not all that high, he is really the only one who kind of has a career that looks like a McKinley, that looks like an FDR, that looks like some of those from the other time. Tom Dewey is another classic example. He's actually in I have a chapter on losers, so he's in my losers chapter.
Have you thought about how any of this translates to members of Congress or what sort of, opportunistic structures might be driving those?
Well, I think what goes on is that they take sides in the competition. So I think that all other office seekers and office holders are basically placing their bets on which aspirant they're going to back. And that either works out well or not for them, depending on how skilled they are. And if it works out well for them, down the road, they may end up being aspirants. But I think the hard part about the lower level office holders is I still buy Schlesinger's theory that there is sort of progressive and static ambition. That some people say, no, that's too risky, I'm not going there. And their ambition prevents them. So I'm not sure what sort of the downstream effects are, but I do think that they are likely surrogates and supporters and, like I said, sort of people who are placing bets on where the party's going. Mm-hmm.
Could you say more about the preference for amateurs? I mean, it seems like those are the conditions to which the aspirants are responding. But what it is exactly that makes it that way in the first place, and just something that occurs to me, and I'd be interested in your response to it, would be the moral opprobrium which can be attached to opportunism is somehow being deflected, perhaps by the work of opportunists, onto, well, are you the corrupt people who have been entrenched forever, as opposed to a sneaky, no good opportunist.
Right.
So, what
No,
do you
I
say
think
about
that,
the amateurs?
well, here's what I believe. I do believe that something very serious happened between Lyndon Johnson and the Vietnam War and Richard Nixon and Watergate. And I believe that those were two of the most experienced politicians we've had from both political parties. And between both of them, I just think you had a phenomenal disillusionment of the electorate of this idea that politics could work, because it so seriously failed in both those instances. And ever since then, we've been all about the outsiders, the governors, this last election was the first time that all the nominees were senators. That was extraordinary. And I think that precisely had to do with the foreign policy environment. People felt it was very important with 2 wars going on to have somebody who had some Washington backing. But, right, the one who won had the least. I mean, pretty much from the time President Obama stepped in his Senate office, he was running for president. Yeah.
So question, Doctor, could you, I'm not in a question at all, but could you say that Lyndon B. Johnson, you talked about Vietnam, but could it also be true that he had such legislative achievements that were clouded by that, and with the Great Society, with the civil rights, things that his years in the Senate really made him very much prepared for?
Oh, I think that's right, but I think that this is the problem. Lyndon Johnson had a great deal of depth of experience, but he didn't have much breadth. He had really, all of that time makes you focused on Washington. And I think this is where what's fascinating to me about these people who are incredibly successful, they do a stint as governor, they do a stint as mayor, they've spent time, in a legislature, then they're up in Congress. They're kind of all over the place. And when you look at their backgrounds, I was very thankful to this library for having 2 massively awesome volumes on sort of the biographical history of everybody who ran for the presidency. And while my sort of data is a little bit different than theirs, because they include everybody who filed an FEC report and things like that, it was incredibly helpful because it gives their full sort of who's who biography, which then could be coded in a rational way. So, yep.
No, me, I'm more of a comparativist, and
Yeah.
like to put things in a comparative perspective here. And then drawing on the question about sort of the outsider or the maverick thing, one of the things that comes up in the comparative politics literature all the time is that if you put America in comparative context, one of the reasons that explains that outsiderness or that maverickiness has to do with sort of the different party loyalties. So people say, well, you look at Great Britain, they don't have mavericks because they owe the ministers have to work their way through and they owe their position to towing the party line. whereas you don't have that as much in the United States. So I'm wondering, I guess, to what degree is sort of the maverickiness more of an endogenous factor that has more to do with the.
Well, this is where I didn't really get into this today, but I do believe that there are very real incentives that the Electoral College and essentially the Article 2 of the Constitution end up structuring. I mean, one of the things that's fascinating is Article 2 of the Constitution is mostly about the selection process, and very little of the presidency literature is really addressing what is the bulk of Article 2. Most of the presidency literature is dealing with them when they're there. And so I do think that you're right. Our system is, I mean, I essentially explain that the parties are developed because it becomes very clear that to win the Electoral College, you actually have to have a party. So the parties are not developed out of, I think, a sort of desire to have an ideological platform. I think they are developed, and I basically make this argument that Thomas Jefferson wanted to be president before the Third Congress began exhibiting party line votes. So in 1791, Thomas Jefferson's already trying to create an anti-administration party. It's not until 1793, and really not really until 1795, that the Congress is starting to actually divide on political parties. Any last questions? No? Okay. Thank you.